He didn't even look at me when he said the words, "We're terminating you, effective now." Just like that, 27 years of fixing disasters no one else could touch, erased by a man who still needed directions to the executive floor. HR stood behind him shaking like she expected me to explode, but I didn't. I walked out quietly, letting everyone believe I'd been blindsided. They had no idea what he'd really triggered, or how fast everything was about to turn. If you want the full story, stay with me. And if it hits home, subscribe and tell me in the comments. He fired me like he was reading a weather forecast, calm and detached, barely glancing up from his laptop as if my entire career were just another tab he could close. "We're terminating your employment effective immediately," he said, and for a second I wondered if he even understood the sentence he was speaking. The boy, because that's what he was, despite the $1,000 suit and the CEO badge, had been in that chair for less than 4 hours. And yet, here he sat, pretending to wield authority he couldn't even pronounce correctly. His name was Brandon Keller Jr., the founder's only son, and he looked at me the way a kid looks at a vending machine that didn't give him his snack. Annoyed, entitled, eager to hit the button again. Behind him, the HR rep, poor Evelyn, clutched a printed script with trembling hands. I could see the highlighted lines from where I stood. She wasn't scared of me, she was scared of the fallout. She had no idea how right she was to be afraid, just not for the reasons she thought. Brandon Jr. pushed his tablet aside as if he'd accomplished something monumental. He didn't ask for my side of anything. He didn't ask for context. He didn't even pretend to care that I'd built half the operational backbone this company relied on to stay alive. No, he just sat there, lips pursed with the sort of pride only someone who's never earned anything can feel. "Security will escort you out," he added, as though the sentence made him taller. He had memorized the tone but not the weight of leadership. That was obvious from the moment I walked in and saw that his Stanford diploma was already hung on the wall. Crooked, by the way. He probably made an assistant do it, someone who didn't dare tell him it looked like a kindergarten craft project. Standing there, taking in the scene, I expected to feel anger or humiliation, maybe betrayal. After all, I'd mentored this kid when he was still figuring out the difference between gross margin and revenue. I'd watched him stumble through summer internships he didn't deserve, heard him complain about workload that wouldn't challenge a first-year analyst, but instead of anger, I felt something else. A clarity, a kind of sharp quiet settling under my ribs. He thought this was his victory, his first executive decision, his big moment. I could almost picture him rehearsing it in the mirror, imagining applause, imagining headlines praising his bold leadership. He didn't know the headlines he'd actually triggered. I handed over my badge without a word. I watched his eyebrows flicker in surprise, as if he'd expected tears or begging or outrage. That's what really disappointed him. I didn't give him a scene he could brag about later. Evelyn exhaled as if relieved I wasn't causing trouble, and security stepped forward, unsure whether they were supposed to look intimidating or sympathetic. I simply nodded to them and walked out, past the framed photographs of award ceremonies, past the timeline etched into the lobby wall, past the receptionist who suddenly pretended to be absorbed in her emails. Every step felt like closing a door behind me, but not the kind they believed. As the elevator doors slid shut, I let myself smile, not out of madness, not out of bitterness, but because he had no idea that firing me was the one move he should never have made. He thought he'd ended something, but what he'd really done was start a countdown he didn't even know existed. Most people in that building thought I stayed quiet because I was defeated. They assumed that decades in logistics made me harmless, predictable, maybe even tired. They saw a woman who worked too hard, stayed too late, handled crises no one else wanted, and never demanded a spotlight. In their minds, I was the reliable engine humming in the background, not the person capable of flipping the entire corporate universe upside down. That's the thing about being underestimated. You learn how to operate invisibly, how to accumulate leverage in ways that don't show up on org charts or leadership slides. And for 27 years, that's exactly what I did. Let them chase titles and glass offices. I chased equity. In the early days, Atlas Meridian Freight Systems wasn't a skyscraper with a logo people recognized. It was a struggling regional freight broker operating out of a converted warehouse with flickering lights and a heating system that coughed like a dying tractor. Back then, the founder, Brandon Sr., couldn't afford competitive salaries, so he offered what he did have: percentages, voting shares, options, small cuts of investor rounds, the kind of compensation people turned down because they couldn't see past the grime on the windows. I saw further. When I walked in as a 24-year-old operations assistant, I didn't know that saying no to a title and yes to equity would shape my entire future. I just knew I didn't want to stay invisible forever. In less than a year, I became the person keeping our vendors from walking, our routes from collapsing, and our contracts from being swallowed by competitors who wanted to crush us before we learned to run. The team teased me for choosing paper over promotion, but every time we completed a deal or onboarded a major client, I negotiated another sliver. 0.25% here, half a point there. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone noticed. Then came the years when things broke. The CFO melted down during a funding crisis. He left in a storm of shouting and slammed doors, furious that no one supported his plan to cut half the workforce to make the balance sheet prettier. He needed cash, fast. I was the only one ready to buy his 12% stake quietly, directly. Then, years later, one of the early investors wanted out after a messy divorce and a private lawsuit he didn't want hitting the papers. He liquidated 18% at a steep discount. I bought all of it. No fanfare, no announcement, just signatures and a wire transfer. Then there was the infamous warehouse debacle, the one where Brandon Sr.'s nephew tried to reorganize half the staff because he didn't like their energy. The aftermath cost us clients morale and nearly triggered a workers' strike. The nephew didn't just get fired. He sold off his remaining 6% to me on his way out, eager to wash his hands clean of the family business. Brick by brick, deal by deal, abandonment by abandonment, I built my ownership until it stood at a number that would have made any reasonable CEO tremble. But nobody bothered to look. Nobody bothered to ask. They were too busy decorating new floors, hiring branding consultants, and throwing town halls full of empty promises. And I let them. I let them believe I was the quiet, dependable director with no appetite for ambition. Meanwhile, every agreement, every clause, every voting packet went through my hands. I never needed to sit in the spotlight because I owned the stage the spotlight shined on. So when Brandon Jr., with his polished shoes and borrowed authority, fired me like I was a disposable inconvenience, he wasn't firing an employee. He was firing the majority owner of the entire company. And the moment that realization hit the legal department, the boardroom, and especially his father, everything he thought he controlled would collapse right under him. He just didn't know it yet. Most people assume revenge happens in the heat of the moment, born out of sudden anger or wounded pride. That's not how real power works. Real power is patient, quiet, built long before anyone realizes they've stepped into its path. And the truth is, the trap that would end Brandon Jr.'s career wasn't something I created in panic after he fired me. It was something I designed 14 years earlier, on a night when no one was paying attention. Back then, Atlas Meridian nearly imploded because of a single reckless decision made by someone who shared the founder's last name. Not Junior, someone older, someone who believed bloodline mattered more than competence. He tried to restructure the warehouse division despite having no operational experience. Restructure was a polite word. What he actually did was fire 32 people in one afternoon because he didn't like their attitude. We lost 2 major accounts, nearly triggered, a labor lawsuit, and spent months rebuilding trust with clients who thought we'd lost our minds. It took endless nights, my own field teams, and 27 separate emergency negotiations to repair the mess. But the damage inside the company lingered, especially the realization that anyone with a Keller surname could wield authority without oversight. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I didn't even complain. I drafted a protocol instead, a clause designed to prevent any unqualified heir from detonating the company again. Section 9F, Emergency Succession Compliance. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't flashy. It was a simple piece of legal architecture tucked inside the revised shareholder agreement. but its impact was enormous. Section 9F stated that if any non-equity executive initiated a termination of a founding member or long-standing senior officer without a formal board vote, all executive authority, including the CEOs, would be suspended pending emergency review. Who controlled the company during that review? The majority shareholder. At the time, I owned 38%. That number would grow, but the clause was already in place, locked behind signatures, shareholder approvals, and the oversight of a legal team that barely skimmed the fine print. I didn't draft it to hurt anyone. I drafted it because I knew the company needed protection from impulsive heirs who confused their last name with leadership. For 14 years, Section 90F slept quietly in the filing cabinet, harmless and invisible, waiting for a moment I prayed would never come. But when I saw Junior sitting in that chair, pretending to wield authority he didn't understand, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I knew it was only a matter of time before he touched the one lever he had no right to touch. So the morning I walked into the building, just hours before he fired me, I filed the activation letter, just in case. It wasn't dramatic, it was precaution. A shield, not a sword. A shield he would foolishly run straight into head first. And when he uttered those words, "We're terminating your employment effective immediately," he didn't just humiliate me. He triggered a legal mechanism he had never bothered to learn existed. The moment he dismissed me, Section 9F wasn't just activated, it was irreversible. And by the time he realized what he'd done, the countdown would already be halfway finished. While security walked me toward the exit, and Junior was undoubtedly celebrating his first bold leadership decision, the real storm was already forming several floors below him. The activation packet I submitted that morning, sealed, time-stamped, notarized, and legally airtight, had just landed on the desks of the people who actually understood what Section 9F meant. And unlike Junior, they could read more than the title. The first person to open it was Mara Singh, our general counsel. I wasn't there to see her reaction, but I've known Mara long enough to imagine it clearly. The frozen stare, the slow swallow, the whisper of "oh no" escaping before she even finished the second page. Section 9F wasn't a guideline. It was a binding emergency protocol with deadlines written in stone. And once activated, it forced the company into immediate legal review, whether they liked it or not. Within minutes, Mara was dialing personal numbers she didn't use unless we were on the brink of litigation or financial collapse. 2 time zones away, board members were pulled out of lunch meetings, strategy briefings, even a tech conference in Phoenix. Assistants stopped asking questions. They just transferred calls straight through with voices that sounded tight and uneasy. And with every phone that rang, the panic spread wider. Junior had no idea. He was probably typing some overly polished email to the entire company, outlining innovative restructuring and stepping boldly into the future, completely unaware that his signature on my termination letter had rendered his title meaningless. The irony almost made me laugh. While he rehearsed being a visionary, the actual decision-makers were scrambling to understand how much damage his impulsiveness had caused. Meanwhile, across town at the Alpine Ridge Mountain Club, a place where the air is thin, the cigars are expensive, and the executives pretend they're not escaping their responsibilities, someone interrupted the founder's sacred ritual. I can picture it clearly. An attendant jogging across the practice green, shoes sinking into the manicured grass, calling out, "Mr. Keller, you have an urgent call from your legal office." Brandon Sr. wasn't the type to respond with grace when interrupted. But this wasn't a regular call. This was Mara, sounding like a surgeon announcing a failed transplant. "You need to come to headquarters immediately," she told him. "Your son executed a termination this morning." He brushed it off at first, probably assuming it was routine. Executives fired people all the time, but then she said the words that would freeze him mid-step. He terminated a founding member without board approval. Silence, then the shuffle of him grabbing his things. "Tell me you're joking," he said. "I'm not," she replied. "Section 9F has been triggered." And that was the moment the founder understood the magnitude of what his son had done. He raced back to the city, still in his golf shirt and cleats, while inside the Denver Tower, panic had already taken the elevator to the top floor. Board members flooded in, their expressions tight, their voices low. No one made eye contact with the receptionists. No one chatted about weekend plans. No one tried to pretend this was normal. By the time the elevator brought me down to the lobby during my termination walk, the company was already in crisis mode behind the scenes. Assistants were instructed to clear the afternoon, schedules of every board member. Conference room Apex, the big one with the Mountain View glass wall, was being prepped faster than I'd ever seen. Even the IT team looked pale, plugging in conference equipment with shaky hands. Because Section 9F didn't just call for a meeting, it mandated one. And every minute that passed without the board convening increased their liability, not mine. Upstairs, Junior was strutting between offices as if he just won something meaningful. Downstairs, the foundation of the company was cracking under the weight of what he'd done. And while everyone else was scrambling to understand the situation, I was the only person walking out of that building fully aware of exactly how the next few hours would unfold. By the time my elevator returned to the 12th floor, the energy in the building had shifted from routine to crisis. You can feel that sort of change in your bones, like a sudden drop in barometric pressure before a storm. The receptionist who couldn't make eye contact during my termination now stood up straighter when she saw me approach, her voice subdued but respectful as she said, "Conference room Apex, Ms. Hartley. They're waiting for you." Waiting for me. Not for Junior, not for the so-called CEO who believed a job title made him untouchable. For me. The walk down that hall felt surreal. 3 hours earlier, I'd been escorted out like an inconvenience. Now the same security guard who shadowed my exit pressed the elevator button for me and murmured, "Good afternoon, ma'am." Like he was greeting the real executive he'd failed to recognize before. But I didn't let myself savor it, not yet. The fight hadn't begun. It was only coiling. When I pushed open the glass doors to conference room Apex, every head turned. The board, 8 people who rarely agreed on anything, sat in stiff silence, documents spread out in front of them like evidence in a congressional hearing. Their faces told the story before anyone spoke. Confusion, fear, calculation, exhaustion. Brandon Sr. sat at the far end of the table, shoulders hunched, looking a decade older than when I'd last seen him. Still wearing his golf club polo, still with bits of grass stuck to his shoes. His eyes were red around the edges, like someone who'd been told there was a fire at his home and didn't know what he'd find when he arrived. He didn't greet me. He didn't have to. The look he gave me held more truth than words could manage. Regret, dread, and a helpless understanding that the damage was already done. Helena Whitford, the board chair, cleared her throat and gestured for me to take my seat. Not one of the guest chairs. My seat. The chair I always sat in during emergency stabilization sessions. She didn't hesitate, didn't ask permission. Just, "Please sit, Eliza." I set my leather folder down gently, opened it with calm precision, and placed the executed Section 9F paperwork at the center of the table like a surgeon laying out an instrument. Helena began reading the protocol in a voice that carried the authority Junior had pretended to own. Per Section 90F of the amended shareholder agreement, the words hit the room like steel. Any executive termination made by a non-equity appointee without a formal board vote results in the immediate suspension of all executive authority and the mandatory reversion of interim control to the majority shareholder pending emergency review. No one breathed. No one moved. Then the glass door burst open. Brandon Jr. stumbled inside, face flushed, tie crooked, holding his phone like he expected someone on the other end to save him. "Why wasn't I notified about this meeting? I'm the CEO." His voice cracked halfway through the sentence, an octave higher than confidence should allow. Helena didn't even blink. "Mr. Keller, please take a seat." "No," he snapped. "Someone explain to me what this is." I looked at him for the first time since he fired me. Really looked. The boy who thought he'd won. The boy who believed leadership was something you could inherit like a monogrammed set of cufflinks. "You weren't notified," I said evenly, "because you don't have the authority to call, attend, or oversee emergency shareholder meetings. You never did." He stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "This is ridiculous. You were terminated. I fired you." "And by doing that," I replied, "you triggered Section 9F, which suspended your authority the moment you signed the termination memo." His eyes darted from me to Helena to the stack of documents, as if hoping someone would contradict me. No one did. Helena nodded to Mara, who opened her briefcase and slid the notarized filings across the table. "Your termination was executed without board approval, Mr. Keller," Mara explained quietly. "Given that you hold zero equity and your authority is derivative, your action activated an emergency review." The blood drained from his face so fast it was almost visible, like ink fading from paper. "Dad?" he said weakly. Brandon Sr. closed his eyes for a moment before answering. "Son, you had no right." The silence that followed felt like standing in the center of a collapsing building. Everyone knew what came next. Everyone except the one person who should have understood the stakes before he ever opened his mouth that morning. Junior sank into the nearest chair, hands trembling, shoulders curling inward as the reality settled into his bones. The room didn't wait for him to catch up. It couldn't. The machinery of accountability had already begun, and it would not stop for pride, ego, or legacy. This was the room where careers ended, and he had walked straight into it. Helena didn't waste time easing anyone into the moment. She lifted her chin, tapped her pen once against the table, and said, "We will now proceed with the motion." Her voice was steady, the kind of steady that comes from decades of handling crises men twice her size caused. "The proposal is to rescind the executive appointment of Brandon Keller Jr., effective immediately." You could feel the air tighten, pulled taut like a wire. Junior's breath hitched. He wasn't ready, he never was. "Wait, hold on," he sputtered, looking around the room as if someone might suddenly remember they owed him loyalty. "You can't do this. I'm the CEO. I was appointed by this board." Helena didn't blink. "And now this board will vote on whether to remove that appointment." His gaze swung desperately to his father. "Dad, say something." For a moment, I thought Brandon Sr. might try to intervene. Old instincts die hard, and protecting that boy had become a reflex he didn't know how to shut off. But then the founder looked at me, really looked at me, and the truth settled like a stone behind his eyes. He knew what Junior had done. He knew how deeply he'd endangered the company. And for the first time, he understood that the empire he built had been held together by my hands, not his son's ambition. He exhaled, long and shaky, and looked away from his son. Helena called the vote. "All in favor?" One by one, hands rose. The CFO, the operations head, 2 investors, legal, compliance, Helena herself. Then, after a breath that stretched too long, Brandon Sr. lifted his hand. 7. The room didn't look at me yet. They didn't need to. Helena shifted her gaze. "Opposed?" No one moved. "Abstaining?" Silence. "The vote is unanimous," she said. "The appointment of Brandon Keller Jr. as Chief Executive Officer is rescinded, effective immediately." If thunder had cracked over the conference table, it wouldn't have hit harder. Junior stared at them, mouth opening and closing like he'd lost the ability to form language. "You're making a mistake," he whispered, but even he didn't sound convinced. "You can't just—" "We can," Helena said, "and we have." He rose unsteadily from his chair, gripping the edge of the table like the ground might give out. "This isn't over," he said, trying to gather what was left of his dignity. I met his eyes, calm and unshaken. "Yes," I said softly, "it is." There was no yelling, no spectacle, just a young man realizing the world didn't bend for him. Security appeared quietly at the door, not aggressive, not dramatic, just present, a courtesy for someone who no longer belonged in that room. Junior walked out, shoulders sagging, the title he'd flaunted for less than a day slipping off his back with every step. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and just like that, the empire shifted. Not with noise, not with chaos, but with authority finally returned to the person who had built it in silence all along. When the door shut behind Junior, the room exhaled for the first time in hours. No one celebrated. No one spoke. It felt like standing in the silence that follows an earthquake, everything still upright, but forever altered. Helena closed the folder in front of her and turned toward me with a look that held equal parts apology and acknowledgement. "Interim authority returns to the majority shareholder," she said, her tone formal but softened at the edges. "That would be you, Eliza." I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply nodded, because this wasn't a victory born of ambition. It was a responsibility I had carried for years without anyone noticing. The board moved through the final procedural steps, voices steady but weary, and when they adjourned, people filed out quietly, like they were leaving a memorial service rather than a corporate meeting. Brandon Sr. stayed behind. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just studied the table, fingers pressed against the polished wood. When he finally lifted his head, his voice was low. "I should have seen this coming," he said. "I should have listened to you." There were 100 things I could have said, 100 ways to twist the knife or soften the blow. I chose neither. "What matters now," I told him, "is making sure the company survives what he almost did." He nodded, defeated but grateful, and left the room with the shuffle of someone carrying a decade's worth of regret. An hour later, my nameplate was back on my door, Chairwoman and CEO, and it felt less like a promotion and more like a restoration. Not a throne, but a seat I had earned inch by inch. The next morning, no announcement went out, no speeches, no dramatic declarations. Trucks rolled, warehouses opened, clients received their shipments. Life continued under leadership it had quietly depended on for years. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it simply returns the reins to the hands that never should have released them. There's something I learned through all of this. Something I wish I could go back and tell my younger self when I was still trying to prove my worth to people who never cared to see it. Power doesn't come from titles, applause, or someone else's approval. It comes from knowing exactly who you are and quietly building the kind of foundation no one can take away from you. For years, I let people overlook me because I was steady, consistent, and not the loudest voice in the room. But being underestimated taught me one of the most valuable skills in life: how to move smart instead of loud. Not every fight needs your fists. Sometimes it needs your patience, your boundaries, and the courage to play the long game. And revenge, if you can even call it that, doesn't always have to end in flames. In my case, it was simply making sure the person who tried to humiliate me had to stand in the mess he created. Just enough consequence for the truth to land where it belonged. I didn't need to scream or gloat. I didn't need to destroy him. Life did the work for me because preparation is its own kind of justice. And I'll tell you this, sometimes forgiveness is self-liberation, but sometimes silence is the sharpest knife you'll ever carry. The real lesson here is simple. Protect your value. Document everything. Know your worth even when others don't. Build your life, your finances, and your career on choices that make you unshakable, because you never know when someone else's ego or insecurity might try to knock you down. But here's the good news. If your foundation is strong, they can't move you. They can only expose themselves. Think about your own life right now. Where are you shrinking yourself to keep the peace? Where are you letting someone else dictate what you deserve? And where do you need to stand a little taller, even if no one applauds you for it yet? How to get started today. Write down the 3 things you bring to your work or relationships that no one else sees. Protect one boundary you've been letting others cross. Take one small action that secures your future, financial, emotional, or professional. It doesn't have to be big, just real. If this story hit home for you, comment below, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more.